Hello and welcome to the annual IDC European Futurescape webcast. It is a great pleasure to be here with you again. My name is Meyer. I'm the General Manager of Research at IDC in Europe, and I'm joined here today by Phil Carter, our Chief Analyst. How are you doing, Phil?
Very good, Tom. It's great to be here, back again with you. Different year, very different year.
Very different year.
Very different circumstances.
And in fact, that's what we're trying to do today, is give everyone a bit of a feeling for the context from our perspective. But what we really want to do in this Futurescape session is to focus on the top 10 ICT predictions essential for creating a sustainable digital economy in 2021 and beyond. And it's been a lot of work, and we'd like you to work with us. So please join the conversation on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and also use the chat function. Tell us what you've learned this year and how you see the future in Europe. Now, what have the teams been up to? Well, it's been quite a ride with 60 analysts.
Very busy team.
Very busy indeed.
Yeah.
We had 60 analysts, 10 squads, 4 intense half-day content sprints. How's that work, Phil?
Well, Tom, back in March, we discussed how a team always shows its true colors in a crisis. And I have to say that this team has really delivered. We challenged them, we challenge ourselves to not only deliver some unique, but also some helpful insights on the permanent effects of the crisis in terms of tech spend, in terms of tech adoption, and then also to think about what's around the corner, what's potentially coming around that we haven't thought about. Because 2020, in my opinion, has really been a year of unprecedented change and an inflection point, to the extent that it'll shape a lot of events for our lifetimes, our generations, but even the overall 21st century. So, what we did is we got the teams to work in squads along the lines of our future enterprise framework. And as I said, they rose to the challenge, Tom.
Well, and in fact, part of the challenge was that we set for them is we asked them to put themselves into CEO's shoes.
Yep.
Really understand what it means that if you are the CEO of the future enterprise, what you have to do in order to steer that ship through the uncertain waters of 2021 and beyond.
Absolutely. And the thinking was, okay, let's use this 5-stage framework that we've been leveraging to help customers move from crisis to recovery and accelerate that journey to the future enterprise. And then we asked the teams to create a set of predictions, trying to answer 3 critical questions. First of all, what have we learned in terms of the response to the crisis? What needs to be done now to build resilience into the business at the moment? And then how do we, as organizations, as people, think about reigniting the fire that will lift society, not so much to the next normal, but to a better normal? And all of that leveraging the exponential power of technology. And so the idea is that those predictions would effectively form the basis for the to-dos, for the CEO, for the C-suite, for the broader organization.
So that's very cool. So this is how we came up with the themes around responding and building resiliency, but also the reignition part as well of that framework. So let's try and focus on answering the first question. So what have we learned? How do we go about that?
Well, yeah, so this is the response phase. And for this, Tom, we went straight to the top. We launched a series of CEO and C-suite interviews to try and understand what CEOs have learned from the last 9 months. And we've got some of their feedback. So I think what we can do is hear directly from them about what they've experienced.
So let's roll the video.
No fear. Actually, the capability to react very quickly in a crisis period of time, it's extremely important. That's what we did. Sometimes we were too drastic, but our employees were fearing the pandemic. So we said we prefer them to feel safe before we look at the results of the company.
Actively seeking out to engage with people. So I was talking to my direct reports as general. And I was expecting that the message would be going down, but it was not actually getting through. You need to engage with as many people as you can.
We focus a lot more on employee well-being. We spend a lot of time on that for the obvious reasons. But being in a global environment, being remote, makes that increasingly more difficult. So we spend a lot of time on that. What is a big difference with us, but also with our customers, is how you deal with risk. I think big corporates deal with risk in very formal ways, tick box exercises, basically, being relatively risk averse and taking a long time to think about what do we do with risks. Well, I can tell you, nobody in the whole world had COVID on their risk register. And it turns out to be the biggest risk we all faced in our lifetime. So that also makes everything relative, what you do in your organization. So I think it's not that people are now more loose with risks, but they plan for the worst.
Another thing I learned over the last 7 or 8 months is that the first time you meet the person might be online. So how do you build trust together? Not only in that first situation, but if you're going to work over time to deliver a project, create results together, and have a longer relationship working with them. And here's where networking comes in. I think it's going to strengthen that you have to trust people online, but you also need to find a way of verifying that and see how you can work together and how you can trust them.
I must say, without technology, we would have been dead.
Okay, so the keywords we heard from the CEOs and from the C-suite members is, well, have no fear. It was all about employee well-being. It's about risk and trust. And without technology, we dead. I mean, it's a very strong statement.
Yeah, and I think that the new leadership model will change as a result of what we've learned. More empowered, more empathetic, more focused on engaging with employees on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and so just to really dig into that point a little bit more, we've got another video for you here now, and it's really around that role of tech in every industry. So let's go to Crawford Del Pret, president of IDC.
We believe the world will look very different. We believe there are many aspects of COVID-19 that have accelerated technology changes, accelerated digital transformation, the move to the cloud, new contactless experiences, and those will be transforming retail, they'll be transforming education, and of course, they'll be transforming all aspects of healthcare. And we believe that as we look back from where we started before COVID-19, this ordeal will not only leave an indelible mark on how people think about the way they interact and how they think about their own health, but the rate at which we invested in technology to change the world will be remarkable.
So Crawford talked about the power of technology and the importance of looking at it from an industry lens. Now, if we sort of interpret this and look at what 2020 has been like, it's been the great accelerator of technology adoption and more specifically digital technologies.
Yeah, Tom, I couldn't have said it better. Basically, we are on this accelerated journey towards the digital destiny. We've, despite the tragedy that is unfolding in front of us or has unfolded in front of us over the year, what has really shone through is the power of technology to help us achieve things that we never thought were possible. So last week, I was speaking to the CEO of a large train manufacturer, and the CEO was saying how in the midst of the crisis, they were able to do a handover of a train remotely. So the user acceptance test, the whole process done remotely, digitally, and they thought it wouldn't be possible, and it was. And subsequently, it's brought in a whole new way of operating for that organization. And what we've seen as a result of that is that there's a divergence in terms of tech investments versus GDP trends. Historically, they always were correlated. 2020 has changed that paradigm entirely. And I think that leads to our first prediction. So if we can have a drum roll, Tom, which is that in 2021, growth in digital investments will outstrip GDP growth by a factor of 3. And I think Julia, our lead for our digital transformation research in Europe, has a bit more details on that. So let's shoot across to Julia to hear about what this means in terms of digital spend in Europe for 2021.
2020 has forced CEOs to drastically accelerate their digital transformation strategies. This is why spending in digital initiatives will continue to grow at a double-digit rate in Europe, reaching $380 billion in 2021 and outpacing the expected GDP growth by a factor of 3. Organizations turning those digital investments into outcomes will ramp up quickly onto the upslope of the K-shaped recovery. Welcome to the world we envisage for 2030 now. Welcome to the digital era, where technology is critical to respond, adapt, and capture new opportunities.
So I want to dig into that in a bit more detail, because that 4.2% growth that Julia was talking about assumes 3 key things, Tom. First of all, a rapid vaccine distribution that will drive down infection rates, drastically fewer lockdowns, and an effective stimulus package, because it's a pretty strong growth rate for a region which has seen significant declines in 2020. So yeah, there's a lot to expect in terms of that recovery.
But then, so a lot of us have been looking at the governments in terms of the response, obviously, to this pandemic as well, and also the European Union. Now, do you think the stimulus packages will deliver what they promise?
Well, Tom, as we've talked about in 2020, we've hit a period in terms of fiscal policy around spendonomics, hashtag spendonomics. Now, there'll be $1 trillion that will be spent across the region in terms of that stimulus impact through to 2025. And we're heading into a situation where governments are potentially supporting zombie industries, zombie jobs, and with the furlough schemes and bailouts. So how long do you keep that going? Now, the good news is that our research shows that between 15 and 25% of that money, that stimulus money, is leaning towards digital investments. And that needs to deliver productivity gains. And more importantly, Tom, that needs to deliver outcomes associated with those productivity gains, because that's what's going to be required to propel Europe to that digital destiny.
So in fact, I guess that's the call to action here. It's the welcome to the sustainable digital economy. And it's super key because globally, we expect that around 65% of global GDP will be digitalized by 2022. And it will drive over $6.8 trillion of direct digital investments between 2020 and 2023. Now, Europe as a region and the European headquartered organizations need to play a big part in that. But Phil, now, when we come back to the CEO, what does this mean as it relates to digital investments?
Well, Tom, I think this is a big question for a lot of the CEOs out there in terms of how they leverage technology to drive that or accelerate towards that digital destination. Really good example of a CEO who may well be listening to Julia is Herbert Diess, who's CEO of the Volkswagen Group. Now, despite revenue declines of around 17% for the first 9 months of 2020, he actually came out in November and announced that they would be doubling digital investments to 27 billion over the next 5 years. And that's, 27 billion, a significant number. And I think he may well have been keeping an eye on the Tesla stock price in the first 10 months of this year. But linked to this, and Julia mentioned this, those digital investments really need to be linked to digital outcomes. You hear the economists talking about this K-shaped recovery where some industries win and others are left to languish. Our view is that this needs to be viewed through a very company-specific perspective. And the extent to which digital investments linked to digital outcomes will be a deciding factor in terms of whether an organization accelerates to success or fights for survival. So 2021 will be a race. This will be a race to outcomes for digital investments. And that K-shape that you can see there is going to be enacted out at a company-specific level across all industries.
Obviously, that's a key point. It's about survival. It's about success on an accelerated scale. But on that point, it's not just a race to outcomes at any costs. So we've seen a rotation of value. So last year, we saw the shift already in terms of value being redefined. So not just the financials, but also ecosystem and societal value, which includes the initial green shoots of sustainability around the climate, but also the citizen, enter the equation at that point. Now, CEOs also have to deliver trust and diversity from our perspective as additional layers of business value. So it's not just the bottom line that organizations will be measured on. It needs a new, completely new style of leadership that is more human, more empathetic, and it's all about empowerment.
I couldn't agree more, Tom. And, it's a complex set of challenges that the CEOs are faced with. And it needs a unique set of solutions. And it's only going to be possible with that exponential power of technology. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing this unbelievable gold rush to join the tech revolution.
But that does leave an interesting question. So what does this mean for technology leadership? The CIO or the new breed of technology leaders, the chief technology officers, the chief digital officers, heads of innovation? Well, to help us answer that question, we've got some inputs from Hugo Timmerman, one of our CIO advisory board members from BAT. So let's hear from Hugo.
Keep the business running remotely is one thing, but we must move from doing the same in a virtual way to doing things fundamentally different. That is a key learning into next year. We've also accelerated the build of our new integrated MarTech capabilities. The role social media is playing, the way we build our brands, the way we transact with customers and consumers, and how we create actionable insight from data have all significantly changed in 2020 and now forms the foundation of how we work across our new categories business. My key learning, we don't do technology, we drive capabilities. And in 2020, I've seen our ambition evolve from IT having a seat at the table to being an integral part of our product offering, of our channels, and how we do our business. Key learning to take into 2021, we should be even bolder about the role that technology plays in every area of business.
Well, I think the message is clear from Hugo.
Yep.
Be ambitious. It's time to shine for the technology leadership. I think that's one of your favorite phrases, Phil. So Phil, we've covered a lot of ground in that first section. Why don't you summarize it with some suggested action items for the CEO based on what we've learned in 2020?
Yeah, Tom. So 3 key things. First of all, never waste a crisis. Develop that learning mindset because that different leadership model will be required for that better normal. Secondly, treat 2021 as a race to sustainable business outcomes. We will see some new use cases that will emerge. Digital roadmaps will have to be recreated. And I think the CEO is going to have to drive that to leveraging technology to deliver those outcomes, but not just financial, the other layers of business value that you highlighted. And finally, give that seat to the technology leader. I mean, as we heard from Hugo, they're ready. So it's time for the technology leadership to shine at the boardroom table.
So that's the response piece of how we look at the stages. And we ran through that before. So response, resiliency, and reignition. Now, how do we need to start, after thinking about the response piece, how do we need to start about thinking moving forward?
Well, Tom, this is all about resilience. That's happening. That needs to happen at an individual level, at a business level, and at a societal level. That's becoming clear. The good news is that with the vaccine availability around the corner, we do see some light at the end of the tunnel. I think the big question that everyone is asking is how long will this tunnel be? And building resilience into the business to prepare for whatever shock is on the horizon is going to be critical. So you think about the captain of the big tanker. You talked about that ship earlier and the CEO steering the ship. So the captain of the big tanker needs to be stable. It needs to be resilient to navigate those stormy waters that lie ahead. But which is quite challenging. It also needs to move fast because that's the new form of resiliency. It's based on adaptation, acceleration, and you can only do that leveraging digital transformation technology. So it's this ongoing balance between risk and speed, which is encompassed in this new form of resilience.
So let's focus a little bit more on the speed aspect, because speed is vital, but it's not always natural for large organizations. So coming back to the tanker analogy, what should organizations and more specifically the C-suite do to execute on this? So where do you start thinking about resiliency as organizations sort of look at 2021 and beyond?
So what we've done here is that we've started to think about our predictions as a to-do list for the C-suite. All of these elements are critical, but you have to work out where to focus when and how do you build resilience and how do you think about reignite? How do we learn from the past? So we've tried to align this in terms of the future enterprise framework, and the to-do list effectively links to those predictions. Now, where do you start? Well, we start with the people, the creating that resilient workforce. Now, at a macro level, you see rising unemployment levels, that's for sure, particularly in the blue collar space. In the white collar space, you see this digital skills gap. There is this growing requirement for HR to move to HX, which is human experience, so that you can look after your people, keep them safe, productive, and engaged. Because 2021 is going to be all about hybrid work. It's across culture, across space, across the workforce, and it's about work anywhere. So Tom, you're not going to work only in the office. You're not going to work only from home. You're going to want to work anywhere, and employees need to be supported regardless of the location. And that's not just the managers or the frontline staff or the back office teams. It's everyone. So our prediction is, second prediction here, in order to do this, HR needs to become HX, which is, and 2/3 of organizations will invest in HX tech, and that will be a differentiating factor. It'll be the basis by which HR functions can attract and retain top talent.
So super interesting, but I think what we should do is hone in a little bit more on what HX is.
Yeah, I think that is a good question, and it's all about game-changing employee experiences to win that talent war. So think about a traditional HR function and the different elements of that process and how those are being reframed, augmented with new technologies, analytics and AI, workflows, automation, to help with creating that nourishing work culture in that hybrid working environment. And that cuts across workspace, so the future of work, these different elements of the future of work. And that we think you need to support the employees through that journey with those game-changing employee experiences.
So you mentioned some technologies already that are going to be critical for this. Can you talk a little bit more about which technology areas this will impact in particular?
So primarily AI, IPS, intelligent process automation, and analytics. So we think that, and we're going to see 53% growth for those technologies in this work transformation space, hitting $18 billion in 2021. So it's a significant market, Tom. Now, a really good example of a company that is doing this is Unilever. So this is Lena Nair, the CHRO, and she's really focusing on putting the human at the center of the technology revolution that is overtaking Unilever, and understanding how important that human factor is. And she's got a three-pronged approach, and the broader organization as well. It's all about lifelong learning. So as we've talked about, developing that learning mindset, changing the way employees change. It's a second priority. So it's not forcing change on employees, but changing with them. And then finally, thinking about new forms of employment so that employees have flexibility, so fixed and flexible employment, which really leads to our adjacent prediction in this space, which is about the fact that 70% of European companies will use technology to enable its equivalency in a borderless workplace. Because we've learned that as a result of in this work anywhere mode that we're in, talent is available wherever you want to get it. So, and it's going to be less about the physical boundaries that underpinned or constrained organizations in the past, but it's about tapping into these new pools of talent that are available across the diversity elements of the workforce that we need to tap into.
Yeah, and we believe that's a very important one. And in fact, that we believe that diversity will be a key talent differentiator in 2021. And there's this war for talent going on. We have to keep that in mind, despite whatever else is going on in the industry. In that tech context, there's a clear war for talent. Now, if we build on from the prediction as well, and we look at the resilient front office, it's going to be critical to build the top line defense at two levels. One is invest in technologies to protect revenue by providing game-changing customer support, while at the same time identifying critical pockets of growth as and when they emerge. So let's hear from Melissa on how we see this playing out. Please roll the video.
In 2021, European enterprises will invest in enhanced customer service and digital engagement technologies at nearly 3 times the rate of the overall software market to drive customer loyalty and revenue growth. The COVID-19 pandemic has introduced a new urgency to European enterprises as it has accelerated the move from physical to digital relationships. Online, it's much easier to switch suppliers when dissatisfied. To keep customers happy and loyal, European enterprises will invest in optimized chatbots, automated responses, self-service portals, and proactive case management. At the same time, enterprises must attract new customers via digital channels such as websites, email, apps, social media, all woven together with real-time analytics for optimized acquisitions journeys.
So what Melissa talked about is that CX is vital for survival, yet another element that's going to be key. Now, we've also seen some very strong growth rates in that area. Can you give us some more detail, Phil?
Yeah, so in terms of that growth rate, what does that amount to? Well, it's $54 billion in terms of across all categories. But Tom, I want to zone in a bit further on the word growth in the last word of the prediction. If you look at that last word there, it's going to be critical for the C-suite, for CEOs, for the broader organization. Now, Melissa talked about seamless commerce. And within that, one of the pockets of growth that we see emerging, which is an interesting one to watch, is this notion of quick commerce, Q-commerce. It's pioneered by Delivery Hero, which is a digital food delivery startup or scale-up or unicorn based out of Germany. And it's defining this new battleground for hyper-competitive delivery in that commerce space. So it's about less than 1 hour delivery on 2 wheels for smaller selection of goods. It's quite a difference. And speed really matters. Now, you've seen one of their competitors, Glovo, already launching the same sort of service more recently, partnering with the likes of Carrefour, Nestle, L'Oreal. And so it shows you how quickly organizations are having to move. And it's all about searching for any pockets of growth that might be available in the next 6 to 12 months.
And interestingly enough as well, so Delivery Hero has obviously replaced Wirecard as part of the DAX companies. Yeah. So what's interesting there is that the pandemic was the great accelerator of digital transformation. But it was also an opportunity to close the gaps that emerged last year, many of which we saw emerge.
Yeah, no, so, and sure enough, as part of our sentiment surveys, this was #1 priority in terms of executives focusing on digital transformation in the midst of the crisis. And the big question is, what would technology architectures need to be like to support this?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, that looks familiar because we've been dealing with this and looking at this for quite a while. So why does this look familiar?
Well, it has. I mean, it's still. This is the tech architecture to support resiliency. I mean, nothing has changed there. We've talked about it for some time, about this need to modernize enterprise IT towards this intelligent core. And then you have the data pipelines coming not only from internal sources and processes, but increasingly external triggers and actions. And that forms the basis for that ecosystem business model that we've been talking about. But what we found in 2020 was that there's still a need to fill gaps in the new digital value chains that have sprung up around this technology architecture. So new digital products and services really needed to be ramped up dramatically. And we saw this as the rise of what we're calling the task app. Remember that one, Tom?
I will.
the task app. So this is the need for speed, comes back to that Q-commerce example, but this is in the context of the technology architecture. It's really accelerated the shift from monolithic applications to modular apps. And they are specific apps which perform or complete one aspect of a business process. So 100% digitization, automated workflows, efficiency gains to do things like contactless, click and collect, curbside pickup in terms of the market-facing side, but then things like employee health and safety, cash flow forecasting, cash flow management on the internal side. And we really think that this is going to be one of the permanent effects of the crisis. That this will be the name of the game moving forward. These are the tasks, this kind of spinning up of new capabilities in a short time frame to deal with a specific problem or situation is going to be what's part of the new normal. It's only possible by a new tactic, Tom.
Yeah, so the need for speed, we think, is going to be delivered by compressed innovation tactics. And they're going to be an anchor point for resiliency to deliver exactly that speed that you've been talking about throughout this. So our prediction is that in 2021, software-led European organizations implementing compressed innovation tactics will take digital ideas to production 4 times faster than the market average, which is obviously a great differentiator at this time. So let's explore that a bit more, Phil. What's compressed innovation tactics and why is it so critical in this context?
Well, that's a good question, Tom. We do need to explore what is compressed innovation. Well, so basically it's agile, platform first, MVP, so minimal viable product driven, so iterative, but then a focus on the delivery of continuous and incremental business value. It leverages cloud native technologies and the new digital value chains from containers all the way through to the new apps, DevOps as a methodology, and then value stream management from a capability standpoint. So a mixture of elements coming together there.
So we're seeing yet another language being developed and created here.
Well, I can tell you, Tom, that you join one of the research calls with the digital innovation team, and it does feel like you're walking into the twilight zone. So, yeah, it is a new language. But what has become clear is that we also need to take those concepts around compressed innovation to the core to connect the back office and the front office. Because last year we talked about core modernization moving to the cloud, but this year that is accelerated, and we're seeing optimization focused at 3 levels. First of all, cost, so data center exits, decapitalization of IT, migrations, lift and shift, all of that happening in terms of leveraging the cloud to drive cost optimization. At the process level, in terms of intelligent process automation, and then finally in terms of value. So you need to, leveraging the platform services from the cloud, data integration, user experience services, all to focus on adding that next layer of value. Now, if you look at these 3 examples, we're going to go to the banking sector, which historically was a slower adopter of cloud, given the regulatory concerns, but you've got 3 banks here, Standard Chartered, HSBC, Deutsche, all of them signing major strategic multi-year deals with the large-scale cloud providers in the midst of the crisis. And there was a big focus on the core because they wanted to lift and shift capabilities into the cloud. But it was beyond that. They also launched new digital services. So Standard Chartered launching banking as a service and virtual banking. Deutsche Bank was launching some new digital services security services for private banking, all in a climate where we might potentially see a solvency crisis in 2021. So it was quite a bold bet by these banks to kind of move into the cloud so aggressively.
Yeah, and in fact, we see this with a number of our advisory board members from the financial services sector as well, who've really embraced emerging tech and new technology and innovation and bringing all these together with the ecosystem and other elements as well. Now, we talked about digital innovation to the core, and to drive optimization. But how does that affect operations? So we're moving into a little bit of a different part of the industry potentially.
Yeah, well, the point is that these are connected, right? So you want to modernize the core, optimize the core, as we've talked about, at that cost, process, and value layer. But we also need to bring a different approach to data and analytics and AI into the equation. Now, what has become clear is that we are dealing with a VUCA economy, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous economy, which is something that we've heard about a few times during the course of the last few months.
Sure, right? And we do expect that the frequency of these unknown events is expected to increase. And so we have to get used to volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity.
Yeah, VUCA in action.
That's
right?
it.
So our research shows, though, Tom, that the AI and analytical models that were put in place prior to the crisis didn't hold up at all. So they weren't able to, companies weren't able to act on the results from those.
Yeah, and that was actually quite widespread. Now, one example here is that when we look at the UK analysis of the spread of infection, that was based on data from the potential flu pandemic. Now, this clearly didn't hold true for COVID-19.
Absolutely, Tom, and that's just one example. We saw multiple examples, and what you want is that resilient ship to be able to redirect based on potential hurricane on the horizon, but more importantly, if it gets struck by lightning, just to understand what needs to be done, what happened, what's the impact, what do we do next. So it's almost like an AI-driven redirecting GPS system for that ship. But if you get the right mix of tech and skills and culture in place, and you drive that decision making to the team level, you accelerate the time to action, accelerate the time to insight, which for operations is very important at this stage of the game. Now, a really good example is Vodafone. And this played out in their operations control center in the midst of the crisis. The CEO, Nick Reed, asking some quite important questions, quite critical questions to the operations center around supplier performance. Firstly, around how much was being spent on a specific supplier. Now, the good news was based on their investments in the data value chains and AI as well. The supply chain team were able to answer that very quickly and with multiple options as well in terms of the risk associated with specific suppliers. And then it kind of prompts the next question, which is more about future looking from Nick Reed, which is, what about changing payment terms? So what if we extend it for the suppliers that we really want to help through this crisis? And then being able to potentially dial it down as well, because you might want to reduce the payment terms for other suppliers. So they were able to do that for 15 days and look at the impact on cash flow, on profitability, on supplier performance. Those are the sort of levers that you need in the midst of the crisis to make some data-driven decisions and really steer the ship on that real-time basis.
Yeah, and I think with about 2/3 of these AI models or ML models not holding during the pandemic, these kind of examples are going to be looked at very closely to help people navigate the next step. And that's where we're moving to now. So we talked about what we learned and how we responded, how we need to think about resiliency. But what about the longer term now? How will we start creating that better normal that you mentioned? Or maybe we need to be more ambitious, like Hugo told us about earlier. How do we get to the best normal?
I like that, Tom. I like that. The best normal. That's what we should aim for. So this is the reignite phase of our thinking, Tom. It has to be sustainable, it has to be innovative, and it has to be future-proof. Those are the things that need to be incorporated into our thinking. So we need to transform that tanker into a sleek, resilient vessel that sets you up for the next decade and even beyond. So let's start with a focus on innovation. Our view is that the intersection between industries is increasingly going to be the source of significant innovation, and the value from this will be derived by these ecosystem business models, and more specifically, digital ecosystems. So Giorgio Nebeloni and the Future of Industries team have been working on this. So let's hear from Giorgio on their prediction on where the future of industries is going.
In 2021, more than 40% of the global cross-industry digital ecosystems based on physical products will be orchestrated out of Europe, adding $125 billion in regional economic output. Every day, networks of organizations from different sectors join forces to deliver value and foster innovation through cross-industry ecosystems. Emerging techs and new business constructs such as joint venture and innovation hubs are at the heart of this transformation. With its strength in automotive, food, industrial equipment, and fashion, we expect Europe to lead the global path to ecosystems that deliver digitally enhanced products.
So Giorgio talked about some pretty big numbers there, 125 billion in economic output and 15 billion in new tech spend. Ecosystem participation and, more importantly, leadership are key for Europe in this. And Giorgio also mentioned the BMW example, and it seems that these digital ecosystems are springing up everywhere. But let's stay with the automotive sector for the moment that you talked about earlier, Phil. What do we see there?
Yeah, well, let's go back to VW, Tom. Do you remember how much Herbert Diess and the VW Group was investing over the next 5 years?
I think more than a lot of nation states, certainly some of the smaller ones. So I think it was 27 billion.
27 billion. I mean, it's a significant amount of money. Now, a lot of the focus there is on building this digital production platform, which is going to be the anchor point for their digital global ecosystem, which is going to connect 122 production plants, 1,500 suppliers, and 30,000 locations, across 30,000 locations. So you really see two critical elements building out here. First of all, there's the internal piece, which is building that platform together with a couple of technology partners. But then the second piece, the external piece, is then recruiting external players. This is where the ecosystem from different parts of suppliers, partners, startups onto that platform to help build apps and new digital services. The first three use cases, and they've got a multiple use case journey for this, first three use cases are digital shop floor management, parts localization, very important for the suppliers, and predictive maintenance, which across the board, across each of those areas is going to be really important.
Yeah, and in order to support these digital innovation initiatives at the ecosystem level, we see two critical trends emerging around the edge and connectivity. So let's focus on those two elements a little bit more.
Yeah, let's focus on connectivity. They're connected, right? So connected, edge, so that they are connected. But let's focus on connectivity first and foremost. A lot of people are asking about 5G and what's happening with 5G in 2021. The team's perspective on this was that this is going to be private. 5G will be the focus in 2021. And most of those deployments, in fact, 1 in 5 European manufacturers and logistic operators will begin private 5G network deployments to better connect operations in 2021. And that will be primarily focused on enhancing IoT connectivity in IT, OT environments. So in those manufacturing and logistics situations. Now, it's not just manufacturing. That's where the focus is going to be. You see this happening in healthcare, but it's all about those low latency use cases. And the private nature of those deployments will enhance security and control. But then there's also a cost optimization piece there because you're going to be consolidating and replacing some of your existing networks. So it's connectivity, security, and then cost optimization are the key drivers there. Now, we do see a brand new set of use cases emerging that will heighten the requirements for low latency, primarily in terms of no-touch or zero-touch factories in smart manufacturing, and then enhance security for smart mobility networks, also in those manufacturing environments. Now, in those situations, those use cases, there's a need for real-time action. I like that, real-time action. But what we see 5G as a trigger for is a new form of IT infrastructure, which we're calling the hybrid edge, because we're seeing this millisecond war where the hybrid edge is the battlefield. So what is the hybrid edge? Well, the hybrid edge is a new concept that we've come up with to reflect this diversified and distributed infrastructure environment across the core, heavy, light, and telco edges that you can see mapped out in this framework. And the architecture here is very much linked to latency. So for technology buyers, you want to put the right workloads in the right hybrid edge location, so because that'll drive the competitive advantage, and that gets you that millisecond advantage that I highlighted earlier.
Yeah, because you mentioned something I think very critical here to understand as well. This is about use cases.
Yeah.
So you're not just investing in technology for technology's sake. These are very much tied to, again, you mentioned earlier, outcomes at the end of that as well. But if we look at particularly the edge opportunity here as well, we've got another prediction here for you as well, because we think that by 2023, spending on the European hybrid edge will double to nearly 14 billion. And we already see a significant ICT vendor focus. It's a zero latency battleground to get that millisecond advantage for the right use cases.
For those use cases. And I think that the connection between 5G and that hybrid edge is going to be one to watch. And you'll see the telcos, the hyperscalers, the SIs, all jumping onto that to try and win that millisecond war.
So that's going to be a very dynamic development to look out for. Now, let's take a quick breather here. So we've covered the importance of innovation and thinking about the future-proof connectivity and infrastructure to support that. But what else do we need to consider going forward?
Yeah, for sure, Tom. So we've looked at innovation and digital ecosystems, and we've looked at these new future-proof environments, infrastructure-oriented to support future business models. But we also need to get this balance right between economic and environmental impact. Now, you know, we talked about the stimulus earlier and the trillion euros that is going to be spent over the next 5 years. And I talked about the digital investments associated with that, the focus on productivity, the focus on outcomes. But we also see that there's 30% of that is directed towards climate action. So in some ways, they're called the green recovery packages. And so you're starting to see this mix between tech and sustainability coming together to create this, hopefully, this carbon-friendly future for Europe, because the ignite phase, the ignition, is going to have to be a lot more sustainable, and it's going to have to be a lot more carbon-friendly. But we need to hear about where organizations can start. So let's go across to Jean-Francois to hear about what the starting point in 2021 should be for organizations.
In 2023, 80% of European operations-intensive organizations will invest in IT/OT, supply chain integration, and performance management technologies, helping reduce region-wide carbon emissions by an additional 3%. That's more than 60 million tons of CO2 avoided on an annual basis, which is equivalent to what Austria emits in a year. We all know a lot must happen within the next few years if Europe is to stick to its carbon neutrality ambitions, something we think all European citizens should be very proud of.
So I think that's a really good prediction from Jean-Francois. I think you see that connection between technology and outcomes, but in a sustainable fashion. But the really interesting thing to watch out for there, for everyone, is that we will see the creation of a completely new technology segment to report, audit, measure carbon emissions across the entire value chain of any organization, from production, from supply chain, through to internal business processes, even customer engagement. So watch out for some of the new dynamics and the startup development in that space. Now, a really good example of all this coming together is with Meyer Drilling, which is in the context of their carbon capture project. So earlier in the year, when we saw that major drop in the oil price, so Tom, do you remember that back in March? Went below zero, which was unprecedented. So obviously then they saw a significant drop in the demand for their oil wells. So big question as to what to do moving forward. And they decided to join a consortium that was led by the Danish government, which was focusing on reusing their offshore oil and gas fields for carbon capture and storage. And so they bought a startup, a clean energy startup, and the focus was developing new technology for carbon negative energy longer term.
So for Maersk Drilling, this is one of several opportunities that they're pursuing in order to help the company's customers move towards carbon neutral drilling operations. And I guess what we've mentioned earlier and what we've seen in 2020, just to highlight that again, is that sustainability has entered the boardroom and has become a critical part of CEO priorities as part of a broader focus on trust. So why is that, Phil?
Well, I think CEOs need to build trust as a key priority, and we predict that in 2021, 40% of European CEOs will introduce new trust metrics to comply with emerging ethical, diversity, and sustainable business practices. Now, they're going to have to partner with the CISO, with the technology leadership, and a range of other members of the C-suite in order to do that. And you might ask, what do those trust metrics look like? Well, it's a mixture of things, but it's not about security and privacy only. It's about ecosystem experience. It's obviously customer experience within that, employee experience, employee advocacy. Diversity is a big factor in terms of that trust. Sustainability. We were talking to an organization just recently about putting ESG goals as a focus, as a metric by which the board would be measured on. So this is real. It's happening at a CEO level. It's a very real thing in Europe.
And so what we've already done in very quick fashion is get through the predictions.
Well done,
for this
John.
year. I think great, but maybe it would be good to just summarize them again in terms of the action points for the C-suite.
Yeah, so coming back to our future enterprise framework, I think it's a useful way of looking at what we've covered. We have covered a lot of ground. It's been a ride. Thanks for joining me for the ride, Tel. So first of all, we have seen this accelerated digital destiny and the lack of correlation between digital investments and GDP trends, and the fact that needs to translate into outcomes, but not just financial outcomes, but sustainable business outcomes for the CEO. But then that also needs to translate into a set of to-dos for the C-suite. First of all, making this resilient workforce, keeping the teams engaged and productive, moving from HR to HX, human experience. This new resilient operations in terms of AI for the VUCA economy. This new hybrid edge. So thinking about the distributed infrastructure that will support those future-proof infrastructure environments. Private 5G networks that we think will happen primarily in the manufacturing space to win that millisecond latency war. CX, top-line defense, is going to be about protecting, but also finding those pockets of growth. Compressed innovation, we like that one, the new language at the task app level, but also in the core to delivering the value. These new metrics for the CEO in terms of trust, sustainable digital economy and the digital ecosystems off the back of that. And finally, this carbon-friendly future for Europe, which is going to be a critical part of the Ignite phase of our thinking, Tom. So, I mean, it's a lot of ground we've covered. I mean, we've talked about what we've learned. We've talked about building that resilient tanker. We've talked about changing that tanker into a new cool vessel that'll reignite the future and achieve that not better normal, but best normal, as you ambitiously put it, Tom.
And that best normal around a reframed version of business value, capturing the elements that go beyond financial, ecosystem, and societal to also capture diversity and trust as well. So we'd like to take the opportunity now to make sure that we thank everyone who's been working with us to create our predictions throughout the whole year. And again, it's been a very interesting year. For those of you who aren't aware of this, we've also launched, we've taken this year to launch the Startup and Scale Up Exchange, so a community particularly built around the innovation companies and the younger companies that we see and the ones that are growing very fast. Thank you to the IDC analysts, obviously, for working with us as well. And Phil, you in particular have driven a lot of the conversation with the CEO community as well. So why don't we hear a little bit more from them about what they expect for next year? So let's roll the video.
Yeah, it's the blindingly obvious, but I think every CEO should have a digital and cybersecurity strategy. I think in the way they deal with customers, the way they deal with their own supply chains, and the way they deal with talking and working with their own employees.
I would say listen to your people, and listen to your customer. Don't listen to yourself. Listen to your people and your customers.
I do believe that this world will end up better than the world that I live in today. Because when I look at my kids and I look at their value system, I look at their principles, it gives me comfort that we are heading in the right direction. There is turbulence. These type of turbulence of COVID and so on, it will come and go. But I think in the longer phase as humanity, I think we'll come out better from this crisis. We should and we will come out stronger. We will come out better as human beings. And I think this is what gives me inspiration.
So some very compelling statements there from the CEOs. I mean, I really liked Harris's view on becoming better humans, which I think is close to my heart. And I think that we can all strive for that as part of the best normal. Anyway, so here's a summary of the predictions. Everyone will get an infographic. The presentation will be made available. And we will also be publishing an ebook on all the predictions at the beginning of next year. So lots to look out for, lots to look forward to.
Absolutely. So now let's go to the engagement part. Let's hear your questions and comments. Let's go to the Q&A section. Thank you very much for all the questions that have come through, that you've shared with us on social media as well as on the chat function. And the team hopefully has been busy delivering some of the answers as well, and we'll try and cover a couple in quick succession now. We only have a few minutes left. So what I would like to do is just to say there have been some questions around the industry research that we have. The recommendation here is not just to look at it by industry, but by sub-industry, and in fact, by individual company as well. Naturally, we can support this. We have a lot of data as well as insight through our teams, and we look forward to engaging with you, but there'll also be more information coming out as we go through the future of enterprise story in our different areas as well. But now, Phil, let me just come to a couple of quick questions for you. The first one is, we haven't really talked so much about the vendor-buyer relationship, so the supplier-buyer relationship here as well. What do you think this will look like in future?
Yeah, so Tom, I think that'll change dramatically in terms of the future enterprise story. I think in the past, it was a product orientation a decade ago. More recently, it's as a service. In the future, it's going to be outcomes based. So we think that vendors are going to have to treat customers as partners and deliver outcomes, and not in months and years, but in days and weeks, and really time to value associated with those outcomes.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, the other one that we haven't covered in such great depth, we talked a bit about we talked a lot about the trust element, but we didn't talk about security so much per se. So how do you see that developing?
Well, it's obviously a really important part. I mean, as you said, it's in trust, and we talked about in the context of those trust metrics. But there's a lot of focus on security technologies in two key areas. Hybrid workforce. Right. I mean, that's as we talked about.
Return to work and then hybrid work.
And that resilient HR story. Endpoint, network, mobile, all of those need to be secured. Then also in the digital innovation side, we saw a couple of companies whose systems were hacked during the crisis. It was a double crisis, in effect, because they hadn't brought in security into the digital innovation approach. So we see a lot of focus on DevSecOps. And actually, the last one I'll just throw in there, Tom, data privacy. The question is, given data sharing in the context of the pandemic response and how citizens view that, what does GDPR 2.0 look like? So we've asked the Future of Trust team to start thinking about that, and the extent to which there might be a new regulation, taking into account the fact that we do need to potentially take the broader societal good into account when we put those regulations in place.
So regrettably, that's all we have time for today. It brings us to the end of this year's Futurescape webinar. Please do remember to fill out the poll. Give us your feedback. Many thanks to all the viewers, the tech community, who's helped us create, hopefully what you'll see as a very compelling view of the future and the context that we're in and going to be in next year and beyond that as well. Thank you, Phil, and all the IDC analysts. Make sure, everyone, that you tune into our upcoming videos. There will be more from the analysts as well as the community as well. So it'll be very exciting so keep your ears out to that. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this session. Be safe and stay healthy.